I'm Dave Kluge, and you are listening to the Dynasty Hotseat.
Oh, yes, everybody. It's the Dynasty Hot Seat, the only Dynasty show out there that is a certified inferno. And we're back doing some more 2025 mock drafts for this awesome rookie class. We got Dave Kluge from the Football Guys back in the house. Dave, great to see you, pal. How you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me. I came on this show just around this time last year and had a great time.
Yeah.
I'm happy you invited me back, Mags.
Yeah, it's great to have you back in the show now. I'm having some time. I might look a little bit different if you're watching on YouTube. Hey, hit that subscribe button if you are. How about that? The camera setup isn't as good as it has been. I don't know what's happening, but we still sound good, Dave, and we're still going to smash it. Well, at least you'll sound good. I'm just coming off my stag do. We call that in the UK. I think you call it bachelor parties, right? Whew. I'm still struggling a bit, not gonna lie.
Yeah, it's on a Thursday, and that bachelor party was last weekend.
Yeah,
Oh boy, it must have been a good one then.
man. I'm still getting the voice back, so apologies if I have to mute and cough every now and again. It was all worth it. It was all worth it. And
Of course.
Dave, before we jump in, this class,
Mhm.
what do you think? What's your thoughts?
I don't have any super generic, or I should say I do have pretty generic takes on the class. I think it's probably something that you've heard from a lot of people already. Quarterbacks are a little bit underwhelming. Wide receivers are a little bit underwhelming. And the running backs and the tight ends are really the standouts of this class. And I think a lot of ado is made about the top of the running back class, Ashton Jeanty, of course, a record-breaking season, Heisman finalist. He's the guy that people get excited about. But then you get further down that list, Jeanty and Hampton, Travion Henderson, Caleb Johnson. Like, there are a lot of other very good running backs as well. And then when you look at the tight ends, that's where I think I get most excited. We've started seeing this changing of the guard in the NFL when it comes to tight ends.
Yeah.
The Travis Kelce's are getting a little bit older. George Kittle isn't the player that he used to be. Zach Ertz is, teetering on that age cliff right now. And then we see this influx of young talent, Kyle Pitts and Trey McBride and Brock Bowers. And I think that just continues going into this season. There are a lot of really fun tight ends. Now, we're not going to get super, super deep into the draft today. We're just going to do the first one or two rounds here. But that's what I find myself doing a lot when I'm doing these pre-draft rookie drafts. Because I find myself in round 3 and 4 going after a lot of the tight ends that are falling there, Mason Taylor and Terrence Ferguson. There's a lot of guys that project to be round 2 and round 3 picks that could have immediate impacts on their offenses.
Yeah, you're right. There's value in every class where you go looking for it, and there's certainly lots of value in this class too. And Dave, no time like the present. Let's pull up our draft board here. 12 team Superflex. No tie-in premium on this one, Dave. So that might take into account where you're putting some of these tie-ins. Let's get right into it. Like I said at the start, if you're on YouTube, hit that like and that subscribe. You know the deal, everybody. And Dave, let's go. Pick one. Where are you going?
I hate to do this. I don't want it to sound like I'm coming on your show and just spitting hot takes here, but I am one of the people that has Cam Ward ranked ahead of Ashton Jeanty, and I know that just seems blasphemous at this point in the draft cycle right now. Everybody is saying that Ashton Jeanty is the consensus 101, but right now it seems like the Titans have set themselves up to draft Cam Ward number 1 overall. They've shown no interest in any of the veterans on the trade market. They went out and they beefed up the offensive line, and it sounds like they are set to go and draft Cam Ward number 1. And we know Brian Callahan is an offensive-minded coach and didn't really have the quarterback that he wanted last year, but I look at them potentially doing the same thing that they did in 2019 when Brian Callahan was the offensive coordinator of the Bengals, and they went with a quarterback in round 1 and picked number 1 overall in Joe Burrow. And then in round 2, they came back and picked up T. Higgins. And I look at a lot of the wide receivers that are falling into that round 2 area, and I could see them trying to replicate the same thing, going with Cam Ward and then a round 2 wide receiver at the top. And if you look at quarterbacks that have been drafted first overall, they're one of the safest assets you can get in Dynasty. I mean, you can look at Bryce Young, who by almost all standards had one of the worst rookie seasons ever for a number 1 overall pick, and his value didn't budge at all going into year 2.
No.
And now we're starting to see that Bijan Robinson, of course, from that same draft class, living up to the hype, playing some great football. But Bryce Young, if he has one good season, he could be right there alongside Bijan in Dynasty rankings. So I know Ashton Jeanty is the belle of the ball. Everybody loves him. But if there's a quarterback getting drafted number 1 overall, he's always going to be my first pick in drafts.
I think it's a super solid take. You notice I hit that. I've got a lovely hot take button, Dave. You may notice it's extra hot in the background right now. I'll cool us down a little bit, and we'll chat a bit about Cam Ward. I mean, even though you said at the start, like the quarterback class a little bit like underwhelming, like it's still a 50-50 shot for me, right? You look at all these
Mhm.
quarterbacks who are taken in the first round, there's a 50% chance that Cam Ward's going to be, terrible and flea him out, but there's 50% chance like he's not going to be. You think about who's at the top of the game right now, of the quarterbacks in the NFL, right? It's that guy with that jersey right behind you, Lamar Jackson. It's
Mhm.
Patrick Mahomes and it's Josh Allen. All had massive question marks coming out. Cam Ward's got massive question marks as well, but I mean, we don't know that. Not even the NFL GMs know what's going to happen here. So I think there's definitely fair value in taking him one overall. It is a much like riskier play, but is that something you tend to do playing Dynasty?
And, that's where I don't see it as a riskier play. I think that this is the safer play. I think that, when if you have to compare, players in Dynasty to like the stock market, for instance, I think drafting a
Mm,
quarterback is like investing in the S&P 500. You're almost guaranteed returns
yeah.
over the long term. We're drafting a running back that's a little bit more like throwing your money in Ethereum or Bitcoin. It could go up, it could go
Yeah.
really high, but there's a lot more risk there. The one last thing I'll say is you said a 50-50 chance at quarterbacks.
Yeah.
And I did a study last year looking at every quarterback drafted number one overall over the last 30 years.
Mm.
70% of the quarterbacks drafted number one overall end up having a 4,000-yard passing season.
Oh, wow.
81% of the quarterbacks drafted number one overall start 80 plus games throughout their career, and 45% end up with a 30 plus touchdown season. So they're arbitrary marks that I kind of use. But I mean, if you're drafting a guy number one overall, you've got an 81% chance of getting a guy who's starting 80 plus games. And whether that's
Yeah.
going to be good production or not, we don't really know. But when a quarterback's drafted number one overall, they typically get a long leash from the team that drafted them. And then even if
Mm.
it doesn't pan out with that team, there's almost always another team willing to take that chance a second time.
And last thing on Cam Ward, he checks a box for me, Dave. I don't know if you've been noticing as well. He's played quite a lot of college games,
Mhm.
and I love that now. I really like that when a player comes out with that experience, with all those reps under the belt, where you might be worried about someone like a Jalen Milroe, or we've seen with Anthony Richardson the inexperience. Cam Ward definitely checks that experience box for me. I don't know about you.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that people used to get kind of scared of was the experience
Yeah.
because it's an older prospect. But I think Bo Nix and Michael Penix from last year have hopefully put those
Yeah.
concerns to rest.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. So we got Cam Ward locked in at one. Does Ashton Genty fall at two for you, or is there a bit of a slide for
Yes.
him?
Yes, I'm not gonna get too
That's
cute
okay.
here. I'm not saying that Ashton Jeanty should fall further than that. I do prefer Cam Ward to him, but, my Cam Ward ahead of Ashton Jeanty take certainly isn't an anti-Jeanty take. It's just that I prefer taking safer assets early in my
Mm,
draft. And, of course, if you've got the 101 and you're able to trade back to 102 and get some
mhm.
extra capital and still get Cam Ward, I think that's the best way to play this if possible. But, Ashton Jeanty, great running back. I don't know what I can say that hasn't already been said. Second behind only Barry Sanders in single season rushing yards. Just you look at every single efficiency metric from last year in the FBS, and Ashton Jeanty is the top of it. He's about as perfect of a prospect as you can get in the running back class. So the consensus 101, I've got him as my 102, closely behind Cam Ward.
One of the things I took over this season, and this is maybe a bit off topic, I was like, man, how good was Barry Sanders? That he had a better season. I can't fathom a better season than Ashton Genty had, but Sanders had it right. And if Genty gets anywhere close to the career that Sanders has, we're obviously talking about an all time great here. And do you think the closer we get to the draft with Ashton Genty, people have been hesitant to put that like generational stamp on him, that tag on him? Do you think that's going to ramp up the higher he gets drafted, or are people kind of been a bit standoffish because it was really that one epic year, but he was good before that too.
He was, yeah, and I think generational is such a funny term because they say he's a general prospect or generational prospect, in the same tier as
Yeah,
Bijan Robinson and Saquon Barkley, who were not generations ago. That was very much so still in our generation. So
yeah.
very good prospect. I expect him to go 10th overall. I think the Raiders sitting at 6 make a lot of sense for him. If he falls down to the Bears at 10, I think that
Mm,
makes sense. I'd be for me, I think 12 is the absolute latest I could see Jinty falling.
yeah, yeah. I agree. I think he's going to go. He's going to go near the top of that first round for sure. And what for you, just in terms of Genty, what for you really stands out as his like key attribute?
The breakaway run rate is bonkers. I don't have it off
Yeah.
the top of my head. I believe 53% is what it was, but I know it was right around 50% that almost 1 in
Wow.
2 times that he would touch the football, he was ripping off 15 plus yards, and that's the metric that really pops out to me. But, for me when watching him, it's the contact balance. I mean, he's one of those
Yeah.
smaller guys, 5'8", but he's got the very thick frame, and he just
Hmm.
can't get knocked off of his platform. It reminds me a lot of Ray Rice, if you remember, from back in the day with the Ravens, just a guy who seemingly never went down. He'd be running through traffic or out in the open field and just getting knocked around like a pinball, but never really going down. That's the type of player that I see when I watch Jeanty.
Yeah, there was that amazing stat, wasn't it? That even if you only counted Ashton Genty's yards after contact, he
Yes.
would still have led college football in rushing, which is just like that. That's not going to be beaten for a while, I would say. So he's locked in a 1-2. Who's going right after him?
Amari and Hampton. And, I talked about it at the top of the show
Yeah.
that this is a class that is very top heavy and deep with running backs. And we still
Hmm.
don't really know who the consensus wide receiver one is. So I am going to go with Amari and Hampton here, a guy who, coming out of Indy at the combine, there were reports that some NFL teams actually have Amari and Hampton ranked ahead of Ashton Jeanty. Now, if you look at the numbers
Yeah.
alone, that's crazy. Ashton Jeanty had all of these broken records and, was just putting up games with just video game type of numbers. But I think when you look at what NFL teams are looking for, Omarion Hampton has nearly 4 inches on Ashton Jeanty. He's got almost 20
Yeah.
pounds on Ashton Jeanty. He still has the contact balance. He's got the speed. He's got the power. I'd argue that Omarion Hampton is actually better in the receiving game than Jeanty is as well. So Jeanty is the clear RB1 for most people out here. But when I watch Omarion Hampton play, I see another guy who is just a ludicrous prospect. Maybe one of the best that
Yeah.
we've seen in the last 5 years outside of Jeanty, not too far behind a Bijan Robinson type of running back. So really easy pick for me at 3, and I don't have him that far behind Jeanty in my rankings.
It has echoes. Obviously, they're very different players, but when we seen Jameer Gibbs come out,
Yeah,
and some teams were like, "Oh, actually, we prefer Gibbs over Bijan, and we take him higher, and we have him like great." And at the time, everyone's like, "That's crazy," but we, Gibbs is a lot of people's dynasty running back number one right now, ahead of Bijan Robinson. So I wouldn't be too shocked to see the same thing happen with Marion Hampton. And I got to shout out Dynasty Hot Seat YouTube commenters, Dave. They love Omarion Hampton so
oh yeah.
much. So they're giving you a large round of applause right now
It's really
for
hard not to
Hampton.
like him. And the other thing I'll
Oh
say is if you
yeah,
look at that Bijan Gibbs scenario, which I've heard compared to a lot here,
mm,
it's almost like Ashton Jeanty is more of the Gibbs archetype, and Omarion
yeah,
Hampton is more of the Bijan archetype. He's the
hmm
bigger, heavier guy, where Jeanty is more of the speedster like Gibbs. So it's kind of funny that we've got him flipped in this draft class with a smaller guy going first. But I see a lot more of Bijan Robinson and Omarion Hampton than I do in Ashton Jeanty.
Do you have them close enough where if Hampton gets like ends up on the Cowboys, right, for example, and Genty gets maybe like a strange landing spot where he's not quite the clear number one, would you even see yourself flipping them if that happens?
I love that question. And yes, absolutely. That's something I've thought about a lot. There have
Yeah.
been some murmurs that maybe the Jets at 7 are interested in him and just going with this power heavy run scheme with Justin
Hmm.
Fields and Brees Hall and Isaiah Davis and Ashton Jeanty. And I think that would be so much fun for real life football, but it would be terrible
Mm.
for his fantasy value. And if that happens, where, again, I don't expect it to happen, but we're talking hypotheticals here, where if Jeanty goes to the Jets, and then Omarion Hampton goes to the Bears or goes to the Cowboys, where he has a
Yeah.
clear path to touches, I would immediately make that switch after draft day.
If he does go to the Jets, I want a camera on Braylon Allen because he's like, I can't catch a goddamn break. Like I've already got Brees Hall, and now Marion Hampton as well. Like that's what I really want to see. Get a camera on that guy. So Hampton, he's locked in at 3. Who's following up at 4? Are we keeping this running back train going?
There are a few different ways here. I think this is where you can go with any position. When you're at this
Mhm.
4 spot, my top 3 is pretty cemented in. But for me, I have my preference here. But you can go quarterback, running back, wide receiver, or tight end here. And I don't think there's
Yeah.
anything wrong with it. I still like Tetaroa McMillan. And I think we're getting to that prospect fatigue part of the offseason where a lot of people are
Yeah.
just getting bored of the same wide receiver one who has been the consensus wide receiver one for months, and he
Hmm.
might not get that, really elite draft capital. I've seen a lot of sharp guys, Daniel Jeremiah and Todd McShay consistently have McMillan falling into the 20s, and that wouldn't be all that different from what we saw with Jackson Smith and Najigba a couple of years ago. But I still
Uh-huh.
think he's a good player. The ceiling outcome for him, when you look at guys with his size speed combo, There are a lot of really good, potential and future Hall of Famers on that list. So there's obviously a little bit of risk there. But for me, the reason I'm doing it now is because I see a path where the Carolina Panthers draft him at 8. And I think it makes so much sense. Dave
Mhm.
Canales needs that big bodied X receiver. We saw it with Mike Evans. We saw it with DK Metcalf. That also allows them to move Xavier Legette into the slot where I think that he could be a little bit more
He needs
useful.
to be. Yeah.
And I think it would make much more sense. So, of course, this take could age poorly after the draft. But right now, I think that if that does happen, where Ted McMillan goes to the Panthers to be Bryce Young's QB or wide receiver 1 after the draft, then we're probably talking about him second or third overall. So I think taking him at 4 right now with that possibility makes sense.
Prospect fatigue is the exact phrase I was thinking of with Ted McMillan because he was the undisputed, without doubt, wide receiver 1 with a bullet whenever I started Dave, I started doing these in October. Can you
Yeah.
believe that? I
Mhm.
started it was real early, and because Luther Burden obviously fell away a little bit, and then Travis Hunter's, and like who knows what's going on there. It's interesting, but Ted for me, he's stayed unwavering as my wide receiver 1 as well.
Same.
It's hard to put a comp on him. A lot of people are like, oh, he's like Mike Evans, but he's almost like nobody really. His body type is so strange, and he like blends a couple of things together. I think he might be, if everything goes well, it might be a guy that people compare the next guy to Ted McMillan. That's the kind of player he might be.
I think the Drake London comp I do like quite a bit.
Yeah.
Taller, thinner receiver, not the best at separating, but really excels at contested catches. I do like the
Mhm.
Drake London comp. That's the one that we settle on in our football guys rookie guide, and that's the player I think I see the most of in Tet's game. But like you said, very unique player with his the flexibility and bend that he has at six foot
Yeah.
five is kind of bizarre to see.
Do you see that clip of him? I think it was from last off season. And he like caught the ball. I don't know. I'm not a basketball guy. I don't know the
Yeah.
move. And he like flipped it underneath his legs and caught it. I was like, that is insane athleticism.
Yes.
Yeah. What's the word? Do you know the word for that, Dave? I'm not a big basketball
Just
guy. Is
between
there
the
a special
legs,
word?
a crossover.
Oh,
They might call it a crossover. I think is what they'd call it
there we
on
go.
a basketball court.
Yeah, nice. I didn't want to embarrass myself. Yeah. We'll go with that. But Techno Mill, super athlete. He's going at 4. Who's following him?
Now I'm going to Travion Henderson, and again, this is where
Yeah.
this part of the draft is very strange. I think that I said it with the last pick, you can go in any direction, and here there's still, if you want to take a quarterback or a tight end, I wouldn't blame you, but Travion Henderson is a player that I have just been enamored with for years. I mean, he started
Yeah.
checking boxes for me a couple of years ago, and um, kind of hard prospect to get a good evaluation on because of the way that he was utilized at Ohio State. He and Quinshon Judkins were very much an RB1A, RB1B type of situation. And I think a lot of
Hmm.
people see Travion Henderson and think, well, he's just kind of a scat back, a satellite back, a guy who can come in on third down. But I think he has a much more complete skill set than that. They just didn't ask him to do those things at Ohio State. But when he was asked to run between the tackles and when he was asked to pass block, he excelled there. So I don't know exactly where he's going to fall in the draft, but it wouldn't surprise me one bit if he ends up going in the middle or end of round 1. I don't
Hmm.
see any world where he falls outside of the top half of round 2. So that you start looking at some of the potential landing spots for him. He can get a really nice landing spot late in round 1, but really just comes down to what a good player he is. He kind of fits that Jahmyr Gibbs archetype for me, where he can do the pass catching. He's got the breakaway runs, but he also has elite contact balance. Just a huge fan of Travion Henderson's game. And as a Bears fan, this is the guy that I'm really hoping that they go out and make a reach for. Not at 10, but if they trade back or if he's there at the top of round 2, because I think that he is a perfect replacement for DeAndre
Yeah.
Swift.
He is the guy that I wouldn't be shocked at all if at the end of next season, it's actually Trayvon Henderson who scored the most fantasy points
Yep.
out of these 3 running backs, just because of that pass catching, and he's such a weapon in that backfield that we all know. We've seen it with multiple players before. You need that PPR upside, and I think Henderson has it in spades. Now, whether he lands somewhere that they're going to use that is another matter, but I love the upside of Trevion Henderson. Don't think he's like in that, like elite Jeanty category, and I keep flip flopping between him and Marion Hampton, but I think that is unbelievable value at pick 5 to get a player like Travion Henderson. We usually see him top 3, right?
Yeah, and every draft is a little bit different, and that's why this is one of the most unique draft classes that I can remember in recent
Yeah.
years because
Hmm.
here we are less than a month away from the draft and there still isn't a clear consensus. You see so
No.
many guys going earlier and later than expected. I'll throw the name out there, Travis Hunter. We haven't discussed him yet, but he's a guy that
Yeah.
I've seen in some drafts going as early as 106. I did a mock draft yesterday where he fell to 210. I mean, that is just an unbelievable range of outcomes for a guy that, we're this close to the draft and we still don't know what to do with some of these players.
Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly a super interesting draft class. Let's go on then. Let's kick on the pick six. Who's going to follow Trevian Henderson?
So again, I'll throw out the term prospect fatigue. Luther Burden was a guy that
Yeah.
just checks so many boxes for me. Just a fun and exciting player, a supreme athlete. I mean, you see the things that he
Hmm.
does on a football field that not many other players can do. And now we're getting to that point where we start to overanalyze all of these players and we start talking about the manufactured touches. But I think it's pretty obvious if you watch these games from Mizzou that Brady Cook was the issue here, and he couldn't push the ball
Hmm.
downfield, so they were forced to manufacture touches to get the ball in their best playmakers' hands. I'm sure they would have loved for Burden to run routes 30 yards downfield and his quarterback to put it on him, but it didn't work out that way. So they had to feed him on slants and screens. But guess what? He excelled with those opportunities and he made plays after the catch. So I think there's a lot of potential here, and he might take a little bit of a development to hit his full ceiling. I
Hmm.
hate throwing this around because it's not a comp. I'm not saying that Luther Burden is a Jamar Chase type of player, but when you look at his upside and his high end range of outcomes, if things do fall in place for Burden and he gets a good landing spot and he develops that deep ball, we could easily be looking at him taking that step into the elite tier of dynasty wide receivers.
Yeah, he's so much fun to. The manufactured such a thing I've never quite got like as an
Yeah.
argument because it's almost like, well, yeah, because he's really good. They want to get him the ball. Like that's a compliment, if anything, right? It's like you want, and it's like, and NFL teams can like do that as well. You watch Malik Neighbors this year. How many manufactured touches did they give that guy? Because he was really, really good at football. So
Amon
you just
St. Brown and
assume,
Tyreek Hill, a lot of very good players
yeah,
get manufactured touches. Who'd have thunk it?
yeah, exactly. So that for me, yeah, is a strange like reason why people knock him. I think it's more of a flip flop. I think you might be in the same boat where it's like, yeah, got manufactured touches, great. That's a tick. It means he's doing some right things in training and he's turning up and he's another one that could just be an absolute like I love the term game wrecker. I think he's
Yeah.
definitely checks that box for sure. He's going to be really interested to see where he ends up and he's locked in at 6. Great value there. Who's going at 7 right after him?
I've got another player at 7 that I see as a very similar player to Luther Burden, a guy who took a lot of his snaps out of
Hmm.
the slot, got a lot of manufactured touches. Emeka Egbuka at Ohio
Yeah.
State played a similar role where he was primarily a slot guy, but he does a lot of the things that are very important in today's NFL. You look at
Hmm.
Cooper Cup and you look at Amon St. Brown and some of these guys who thrive out of the slot, they get those opportunities because they do the things outside of just catching passes. They're fantastic blockers. They're willing and able and aggressive when it comes to getting in the run game, and then that allows coaches to just keep their base personnel on the field knowing that they have a guy who can contribute as a weapon in the receiving game and as a blocker, and then those extra snaps turn into routes run and those routes run turn into targets, and that's how you see these guys blow up out of the slot. And that's the type of path that I see a guy like Emeka Egbuka taking. Right now, he's projected to go first round in a lot of mocks. Sometimes they have him falling
Hmm.
early into round 2. But I think that if he does get that first round draft capital, even if he is right now at this point in his career kind of relegated into a slot role, we've seen a lot of guys come into the NFL as a pure slot player and then develop over time and start learning to play out wide. We've seen that with Jackson Smith-Njigba last year. We saw that with Amon St. Brown early in his career. We saw that
Hmm.
with Cooper Kupp back in 2019. So, well, the ceiling for Egbuka might be limited out the gate. He has the potential to blossom into a very, very good player.
Yeah, I love getting like a super solid, safe slot receiver is just so nice for any dynasty team you have. You don't have to worry about it. You put them in, you know the points are going to come, and you can worry about taking risks in other positions. So a guy like Ibuka, who we spoke about prospect fatigue a few times, Dave, I feel like he's coming out the other side of that now, where we've
Right.
seen him fall to like the second round in some mocks beforehand. Man, I was getting excited about getting Ibuka at the back of the first. I don't think there's any chance that's going to happen anymore. This is just right for me for Ibuka as well. So really looking forward to seeing where he could go. And man, every team needs a slot receiver. He's going to get the action out there for sure. So he's locked in at 7. Who's right after him at pick 8?
Now, this is a tough one for me because early in the scouting process, as I start looking at these players, there was nothing about Matthew Golden that I especially liked.
Mm,
But I am, I use draft capital as kind of my guiding light when I'm doing rankings, and it's impossible to ignore the buzz that he's been getting out of the combine. A lot of
Yeah.
people are ranking him as their overall wide receiver one. It seems like every mock now has Matthew Golden going in round one. And while I do have some concerns about his versatility, like I said, if we're trying as best as we can to read the tea leaves and predict what's going to happen in April. The reality is that if Matthew Golden is drafted as the wide receiver one, even though I prefer Luther Burden and Emeka Buka to him right now, if those guys fall into round two and Matthew Golden goes eighth overall to Carolina, I'm not going to hold on to my priors. So this is me hedging a little bit. When I did
Mm.
my initial batch of rankings before the combine, I had Matthew Golden as kind of an early round two pick, but after a great performance at the combine, checking the athletic boxes with a elite relative athletic score, and now starting to get more and more buzz from teams, I feel like this is where I think it's a little bit early for Matthew Golden, but if he gets that early draft capital in April, he'll be going even higher than this.
It's kind of a name that it's been really nice that someone has benefited from the combine, because the combine for years has kind of been like dwindling away, and Matthew Golden's kind of a story where you're like, this is what happens when you actually, you turn up, you suit up, and you smash it at the combine. Like, he was someone that wasn't even being mentioned in the first two rounds in some of these mocks not so long ago, and now it looks like he's going to be in most people's first round, which is nice to see, Dave. I don't know about you. I felt just a bit flat after the combine this year.
It wasn't the best. I think having some of the big names sit out was disappointing. We would have loved to see Ashton Jeanty out there performing. We would have loved to see Tyler Warren and Colston Loveland, but unfortunately it didn't happen that way. It was kind of a weird year, especially last year when a lot of the big names did compete and we saw Xavier Worthy go out there and break the all-time record.
Yeah.
I think it was going to be tough to follow up last year's combine, and this one unfortunately came up flat, but there were some big standouts for me. Again, a name I threw out there, Mason Taylor, was a guy for me that
Yeah.
I had as my tight end 8 going into the combine, moved him all the way up to tight end 4 afterwards because it was just impossible to ignore how good he looked out there. So there were definitely some winners and losers for the combine, but overall it was kind of a quiet year.
Do you think Isaiah Bond actually like secretly helped out his teammate here by saying he was going to break the record and then his teammate ran faster than him?
I think that probably had something to do with it. I'd be lying if I said I didn't. But look at last year. I think Xavier Worthy is another example of a guy. Most people had like a round 3 grade on Xavier Worthy, and then he came out and smashed the combine. And all you need is for one team to take a risk. Now, if Kansas City didn't take Xavier Worthy, there's no guarantee that another team in round 2 would have. But Kansas City made that move to trade up and take him. He got the first round draft capital we wanted to see and had a great close to his rookie season. So Matthew Bond, Matthew Bond. I'm combining them together. Matthew Golden, another guy who a lot of people were looking at as a day 2 pick. All it takes is one team. And, if Dallas is there and they have fallen in love with him based on what they saw, based on the interviews they had, it's all it takes. Dallas could pull the trigger at 12, and then Matthew Golden is probably the immediate wide receiver one in this class.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's going to be fascinating to see where he goes. And a nice one of receivers here. Is that continuing at 9?
As much as I'd love to, because there's a receiver I really like, I know I can get him a little bit later in most drafts. So this is where I go to Shedeur Sanders, and this
Yeah.
is probably another one that surprises people. It is weird. I think that we have just heard for so long that this is a bad quarterback class, and because of that, everybody is just treating these quarterbacks as if they're radioactive and they want nothing to do with them in drafts. But the reality is, every single major mock that has come out recently has Shedeur Sanders as a top 3 pick. Now, whether that's him going to Cleveland or going to the Giants or them trading and flip flopping, almost no mocks from these insiders who are pretty plugged
Hmm.
in have him falling outside of the top 3. And say what you want about Shedeur Sanders, he might not have the elite athleticism and the rushing upside that we want to see, but if he falls into a position where, let's say, he gets drafted to go to the Giants and he's throwing passes to Malik Neighbors, I don't think you're going to worry too much about his athleticism because you're getting the points after the catch. And what we saw at Colorado is that he is a very accurate quarterback that can get the ball in his playmaker's hands. So this again comes down to draft capital here. Shedeur Sanders was the QB1 not too long ago, and I think a lot of people, if you said you started doing this in October, I'm sure you've done many a mock draft where Shedeur Sanders was the number 1 overall pick. We've cooled off on
Hmm.
him a little bit since then, but still, if the quarterback is going inside the top 3, there's no reason he should be falling outside of the first round in your dynasty drafts.
So what happens you spoke about earlier, Cam Ward if he goes one over? What happens if Tennessee kind of pull the rug from under people, and it's actually Shedeur Sanders that goes number one? What do you do with him then?
I would then put Shedeur Sanders ahead of Cam Ward in my rankings. As I talked about, I did this study last year where I kind of looked at these thresholds that I had built to see how draft position in the first round correlates to value. And, I'm not reinventing the wheel here, but I was kind of shocked to see that the numbers back it up even more than you would expect to. I mean, like a player drafted, a quarterback drafted number one overall is almost always going to perform better than a guy drafted number two overall, and they're going to perform better than the guy drafted three overall. And of course, we remember the outliers, right? Like we remember
Yeah.
that Bryce Young went ahead of CJ Stroud. And we remember that Patrick Mahomes slid in the draft and that Josh Allen slid in the draft and that Aaron Rodgers slid in the draft. But at the end of the day, those are outliers. And for
Mm.
every Patrick Mahomes who fell to 10, there's a lot of guys drafted at 10 that didn't do much of anything at all. So for me, especially when it comes to quarterbacks, I'm going to defer pretty heavily to draft capital. And I think last year is a perfect example of where we
Yeah.
overthought that. I mean, we saw Bo Nix and Michael Penix get drafted inside the top 12, and dynasty managers still said, well, I'm smarter than NFL teams. I'm not drafting these guys until round 2, round 3. And the reality is, in hindsight, they probably should have been top 6 picks in your dynasty drafts. So I want to learn from mistakes that we've made in the past. If Shedeur Sanders gets that top 3 draft capital, I'm taking him early in my rookie drafts.
I absolutely love that. I remember screaming from the hilltops on this show last year. It's like if you're in like the second round and someone for whatever reason hasn't taken Michael Penix or Bo Nix, you need to trade up and get like it's basically a free like first round pick because they're first round players.
Yep.
You need to trade up and go get it. And hopefully people listening did go for it. And hopefully they'll listen this year and make sure they don't miss out on a guy like Shedeur Sanders if he goes top 3. He is at pick number 9 for you, Dave. Who's going right after pick 10?
Quinshon Judkins, another running back out of Ohio State. I talked about earlier how it was kind of a tough evaluation process because of the way that these guys split touches. And Quinshon
Mm.
Judkins, I think that in the same way people thought Travion Henderson was only a third down satellite back, I think a lot of people thought that Quinshon Judkins was only an early down plotter, and him getting chased down on a breakaway run in the national championship game certainly didn't help people
Mm.
dismiss their ideas that he didn't have long speed. But that was one play. Who knows? He could have been gassed from previous plays, whatever it may be. But he came out in Indianapolis and answered all of the
Yeah.
questions about his athleticism and given us one of the best performances of the weekend. Hitting all of the drills that I want to see, the 3-cone and the shuttle, also giving us a very good 40 time, weighing in big and heavy and strong, just across the box or across the board, had himself a very good
Yeah.
weekend. So Quinshon Judkins is another guy that we didn't see a lot of pass catching from in college. We saw him kind of in this early down role, but I think that his skill set is much more well-rounded than people realize.
I was thinking the other day about Judkins and what would have happened if he stayed at Ole Miss. Like, obviously, they didn't have. Is it? They've got like Priestley or Priest something, right?
Mhm.
As their running back. If he'd stayed there and been the bell cow, I wonder if we'd be having a different conversation about Quinshon Judkins.
I wonder that too. And just recently, I was watching his highlights from Ole Miss, and I was like, my goodness, like he was catching passes and he was hitting
Yeah.
breakaway runs and doing so much more there. But Ryan Day at Ohio State has this very pro style offense where they want to have their early down guy and their third down guy. Um, And of course, that could happen to Quinshon Judkins, where he can get
Yeah.
relegated to an early down role in the pros. But if he lands in a position where he can get a 3-down role, he can do that. And really, with running backs, I mean, you're not hoping that this guy's going to get drafted and be a 3-down back for the next 5 years. What you're hoping is when the opportunity arises, can he be a 3-down back and give me a weekly upside? And he can do that. So even if he gets
Yeah.
drafted somewhere where he doesn't have an immediate path to relevance, he's a tweaked injury away, a tweaked ankle away, any sort of injury that can get him on the field. And when that opportunity does come up, then he's that guy that we're looking at as a 20, 25 point per week type of player.
Even if he ends up somewhere like the Ravens as the heir apparent to like a Derrick Henry, I love that for him. I'm I'm
Yeah.
I'm really ready to. I'd love taking him here, and that'll put people off. But you're like, no, you have to just remember like the talent, and it will. Like Derrick Henry's not going to go forever. These players don't go forever, especially at
Mhm.
running back. So yeah, I really like Judkins. I think he's really sneaky value here at the back end of the first, where he seems to be falling to quite often now. So there are two players left in the first round. Who are you going to go for with your penultimate pick?
Tyler Warren is a guy that I really, really like, and it's tough, when you look at mock drafts this time of year, I've seen him all over the place. I expect him to go 7 to the Jets, but, talking with my co-host Jeff Bell earlier this week, he pointed out that Jeremy Ruckert and Justin Fields were teammates in college, and that could secure Ruckert's position as the tight end there in New
Mm.
York. So, I've seen other drafts where he falls outside of the top 20, but for me, when I watch Tyler Warren, I just see no flaws in his game. I mean, sure, you could say maybe there was a late breakout age, I guess is the only blemish on his profile, but he's a guy who can play in line, he can play in the slot, he can play out wide. They even used him as a running back on multiple occasions. I mean,
Yeah.
he is just such an athlete. I think he's going to be one of those guys that gets drafted and immediately week one is going to be a focal point of his offense.
Yeah, he's just so much fun to watch. Like I've said a couple of times, and it's like it comes out like an insult, but it's really not. Like he's like watching Taysom Hill, but like
Yeah.
a young Taysom. Like if he started football earlier in his career, where you're like, whoa, like this guy's like such a superb athlete. He's so much fun to watch. What do you have a dream landing spot for Tyler Warren where you're like, this is like I don't even need to move him up if he ends up here?
Well, I think the dream landing spot for any tight end in this draft would be falling down to 22, Los Angeles Chargers. I think that's the one
Yeah.
big missing piece from this offense. However, Colston Loveland, with the connection to Jim Harbaugh
Yeah.
from Michigan, I've just got that in ink on every single mock draft that I've been doing. I'd be very shocked. But of course, the team might take Colston Loveland earlier than that. He might not be available. I don't think that Tyler Warren falls that far either. So what I've seen a lot of is him 7 or 8. I like him going to the New York Jets where they need some sort of secondary pass catcher behind Garrett Wilson. But I also think that Carolina has shown that they really like these um, very athletic guys. And we've seen them, you can go all the way back to Laviska Shenault, but they've also done it at the tight end position with Tommy Tremble. They like to get these guys that have these very good athletic profiles. We've also seen Jonathan Mingo and Xavier Leggett. And I think that Tyler Warren kind of fits that box for them. So those are the two picks that I really like, the Jets and Panthers at 7 and 8. But you did talk about Taysom Hill, seeing shades of that in his game. I know the Saints just went out and re-signed Juwan Johnson to a 2-year contract, but with Taysom Hill being 35 years old, coming off the ACL tear, they might draft
Yeah.
Tyler Warren to be that next guy up.
Yeah, that's where I would love him to. I would love him to go to the Saints. I think that'd be so much fun, and I want to see them both on the field. No one knows what's happening. I have to say, like, yeah, that's what I want to see next season, Dave. I can't wait. Hopefully, he goes there. So, one more pick left of the first round after Tyler Warren. Who are you locking in?
So this might be a little bit of a reach. I try to stay as unplugged from ADP as possible because I don't want it to cloud my judgment too much. But Trey Harris is a guy that I just absolutely love. The
Yeah,
more I watch him, the more I like him. You're probably gonna have to scroll down a bit to find him because
I
he isn't
got
one of
him.
those guys that's going first round in a lot of picks. But I mean, the analytical profile alone is mind blowing. He had over 5 yards per route run last year. I mean, we're looking for guys who can check the box to hit two. He had five
Yeah.
yards per route run. Now, that's not the only thing that I like about his game because yards per route run, Dwayne Eskridge also hit that box of 5 plus
Mm.
yards per route run a few years ago. So that's not the end all be all. When I do look at Trey Harris, I think that what they asked him to do at Ole Miss was a little bit disappointing. It was just kind of vertical balls and slants, and they didn't ask him to do much more outside of that. So I think that he is a developmental guy. I don't think he's
Yeah.
the type of player that you can just draft and immediately plug in. He's your wide receiver one in week one. But there are a lot of good landing spots at the end of the first round where teams don't need that immediate production and they can draft him, kind of let him develop a little bit. And it wouldn't surprise me if we see that late season rookie year breakout, but he just has the size, speed, athleticism, refinement. He's got the bulk tracking skills. He can attack at the
Yeah.
catch point. There really isn't anything that I see in Trey Harris's game that I don't like outside of the way that he was utilized at Ole Miss. But just because he was used improperly at Ole Miss doesn't mean that he's going to be used that same way in the NFL.
How much do you think his injury played into this as well? Because he was on track for a historic season, and he missed a little bit of time. That hype kind of killed off a little bit, but I think if he stayed healthy, we'd be talking about Trey Harris up with that group of three with Burden, Igbuka, and Matthew Golden.
Yeah, and I mean, I had Trey Harris ahead of Matthew Golden and Emeka Egbuka. Again, I'm trying to look at mock drafts this time of year from smart people who are plugged in and try to, guesstimate on draft capital a little bit. I think Trey Harris has a higher ceiling than both of those guys. But
Yeah,
if they're drafted round one, which it appears that they're locked into, and Trey Harris falls into round two, The reality is when I'm doing a lot of mock drafts and rookie drafts right now, I can typically get Trey Harris in the middle of round 2. That's typically where he's fallen to 204, 205, 206, and that's where I like to draft
Yeah.
him. But if I'm picking at 112 and I know he's not going to make it back to me at 212, and there's no way for me to move up, I'd rather get my guy Trey Harris than draft a guy that I'm not quite as crazy about at that spot.
I'm a big fan of that as well. It's like, go if there's no way you can move that pick, if there's nothing you can do, just listen to what you think and trust your own rankings and go and get your guy. And that's, yeah, I'm a big proponent of that as well, Dave. So we finished round one. Let's sort of ramp up the speed a bit for round two. So Dave, here's what we'll do. I'm gonna ask you to give me sort of 3 players in a row. I'll lock them all in to sleeper, and then we'll choose one to focus on.
All right. So at the top of round 2, I've got Travis Hunter, Caleb Johnson, and Jaden Higgins. I don't know if there's any huge surprises there. Caleb Johnson was a guy who I wasn't crazy about coming into the combine because we saw the breakaway runs in college, but the speed can sometimes be a little bit deceiving in college. You know, running away from a guy on a college field is a little bit easier than running away from a guy in an NFL field, and then him coming
Mhm.
out and don't get me wrong, had a very good size adjusted speed score, but didn't have the best 40 time. That did kind
Yeah.
of corroborate some of the concerns that I had about him going into that week.
Yeah, and Higgins is a name that is sort of slowly been like creeping in a little bit. I mean, Travis Hunter, I feel like has been talked about to death almost. I mean, no one's really going to figure out like what's going to happen with him. But what do you like so much about Higgins?
Higgins, I am a sucker for size and speed, and that's probably why, I reached for Trey Harris where I did. But, you see these guys, they just have such high ceilings. And the
Yeah.
reality is we've seen a lot of these guys with this archetype bust as well. The size
Hmm.
speed combo doesn't always translate to the NFL, but Jaden Higgins, much like Trey Harris, is just such a polished receiver. Like it's not just blind athleticism that is helping him produce in college. It's the ball skills and the release package and the route refinement and the ability to trick defenders by getting leverage on him. He does all of those really minute things about the game that just make him look like a much more polished receiver than, say, a Kevin White or a N'Keal Harry or one of these other side speed guys that have busted at the NFL.
And shout out N'Keal Harry. Wow, he was hot for a minute there, right? People got excited about that guy.
Yeah.
Hopefully Higgins ends up a little bit. Is he playing tight end now, N'Keal Harry? I don't know. I'm not sure. I think
I don't even know if he's in the NFL anymore, to be honest.
I'm not sure. Maybe he's trying
A
out for the
switch to
flag football
tight end
team.
would have helped him for sure.
He,
Yeah, it looks like he's
yeah.
playing in the Canadian Football League now. So glad he was able to land on his
Wow.
feet somewhere.
Canadian. Shout out Kyle Sanders, fan of the show. Big Canadian football fan. So shout out Kyle. Let's go. Let's get 2, 4, 5, and 6 locked in as well, then, Dave, shall we?
So I've got a tight end run here. These are all going to be tight ends:
Yes.
Colson Loveland, Terrence
Yes.
Ferguson, and Mason Taylor. Um, like I said, this is a good tight end class, and I actually do in my rankings have Terrence Ferguson ahead of Colson Loveland, which I know is blasphemous, but he's the player that I want to talk about here. You look
Let's do it.
yards after the catch per reception. No tight end had more than Terrence Ferguson last year. He averaged 9.0 yards after the catch per reception, which is just a
Wow.
mind-blowing number. And I look at Colson Loveland, he is also a very good receiver, but he can also do a lot of the inline things. And especially when he was at college with Jim Harbaugh, they were asking him to block, they were asking him to play inline. And for me, I think that he will probably be drafted ahead of Terrence Ferguson. But I think that Terrence Ferguson, because of how good he is as a receiver, I mean, he plays
Mhm.
the game like a 6'5" receiver, and he lined up in the slot on over 50% of his snaps. He can line up out wide as well. I think his ceiling with the athleticism and with the yards after the catch ability set him up for a really high ceiling in fantasy football. Now I've got him right here going at the 205, and a lot of mocks that I've done, I typically can get him at the top of round 3 or the end of round 2, and I think that's more of a fair value. But going off of my rankings right now, this is where I think Terrence Ferguson deserves to go, is in the top half of round 2. I think that he probably gets drafted in round 2 in the NFL draft as well. I don't think he's going to sneak into the first round, but if you can get that round 2 draft capital with the athleticism that we saw at the combine, the ceiling for Terrence Ferguson is just so high.
And as well, like if you get that Oregon team, a lot of mouths to feed, and he still stood out as a really good player there. I mean, they had like Evan Stewart, they had Tez Johnson, they had a lot of guys to get the ball to, and Terrence Ferguson always stood out watching Oregon. And I know it didn't end so well for them, but they had an unbelievable season up until that point. So I think Ferguson, it's about damn time someone put respect on his name, Dave.
Yeah, he was my tight end 3 coming into the combine, and then, I actually had a Harold Fannin ahead of him. Now, I don't want this to sound like I'm super overreactive to the combine, but tight
Mm,
ends are the position that I do move the most combine, after
mhm.
the combine because we've seen that athleticism really translates to NFL success, and NFL teams are willing to reach for those really athletic guys, so Harold Fannin was my tight end too, but after, not a great combine performance. He fell down to tight end 2, which pushed Ferguson up to or he fell down to tight end 5, which pushed Ferguson up to tight end 2. So just a huge, huge fan of his game.
I love it. And do we see Hal Fannin in the next run of 3 players at 7, 8, 9?
No, we'll get to him by the
Mm,
end of round 2, but I
okay.
have a running back run coming up right here, and this is
Ooh,
Cam
alright.
Scatabo, RJ Harvey, and Devin Neal would be the next 3 for me. I really want to move RJ Harvey ahead of Cam Scatabo. The more I watch RJ Harvey, the more I like him. He is just a jitterbug. He's got that kind of human joystick type of way that he plays the game. And I just tweeted this out yesterday. His efficiency metrics were just mind blowing. I looked at a sample of running backs last year that had 200 plus carries in the FBS. There were 31 of them. RJ Harvey was second in yards per attempt behind only Ashton Jeanty, second in rushes of 10 plus yards behind only Ashton Jeanty, second in rushes of 15 plus yards behind only Ashton Jeanty, and then fourth in breakaway run rate, sixth in yards per route run, eighth in missed tackles, ninth in yards after contact per attempt. I mean, he is a home run waiting to happen every time he touches the ball. The one thing that I think is concerning is that he does always look for that big gain. He bounces a lot of runs outside, which is frustrating because he's a very
Yeah.
good runner through traffic. When he runs between the tackles, that's when you see some of his best plays. But he does have this. I call it DeAndre Swift syndrome, where you just try to bounce every run outside and you don't trust yourself to go between the tackles. So I think with the
Mhm.
right coaching and the right development, they can turn him into a very good player. But he's got the athleticism that I just love for a running back.
You are speaking my language, Dave. RJ Harvey. If I had to pick one player as like the quote unquote my guy,
Yep.
it's RJ Harvey with a
Same.
bullet for me. Like he is so much fun to watch. It's been it's been nice and annoying seeing him rise up the ranks because I'm like, God
Mhm.
damn, I'm not getting as many RJ Harvey shares as I thought I was going to. Because he was going like pretty solidly in the third round. It's like I'm gonna get so much RJ Harvey, but it seems
Nope.
like
Not anymore.
he keeps creeping up, man. Uh, there might be a genuine debate between Caleb Johnson and RJ Harvey by the time we get past the NFL draft. Like, it wouldn't shock me if a team goes and sees all of those statistics that you just rattled off and go, "Well, I got to take Caleb Johnson. I can take this RJ Harvey guy instead."
Yeah, and I like Scatterbo a lot, and I think that people have this
Hmm.
idea that Cam Scatterbo is just an early down guy because he doesn't have the breakaway speed, but he was also a target magnet at Arizona last
Yeah.
year. I mean, he was catching a ton of passes, so I think he is kind of a guy that we may have, start to get pushed down in rankings a little bit because he didn't test at the combine. But Scatterbo's a guy that those two, Cam Scatterbo and RJ Harvey, I have very closely behind Caleb Johnson. It seems like everyone has the top 5 and then a huge tier break and then the rest of the running backs.
Yeah.
I don't think Scatterbo and Harvey are that far behind Caleb Johnson.
Someone needs to check Cam's got a boost birth certificate. That's what I'm saying. That guy, there's no way he's 22. That guy looks like well north into his 30s. One of those guys like playing against kids when he's in his deep 30s. But he's done a good job for sure. Cam's got a boost, especially in the playoffs. My goodness me, absolutely smashed it. So Dave, we got one more group of 3. You said Harold Fannon's appearing in here. Whereabouts and who's his other 2 compatriots beside him?
So this is going to be Jalen Royals, Harold Fannin, and Jalen Knoll are the 3 that I have here. And it's tough because I feel like, going through round 2 and not mentioning Elijah Arroyo is unfair. He would be the next pick for me at the top of round 3. But
Yeah,
still, I think these 3, Harold Fannin, I don't know who you want to talk about here. Harold Fannin was a guy that I loved. I mean, you look at what he
yeah,
did at Bowling Green last year, unbelievable. But as I mentioned, relative athletic score does correlate pretty closely to fantasy production and draft value. And I think that now, looking at Harold Fannin not checking the boxes for elite athleticism, you're kind of hoping that he has the Isaiah Likely route where he's drafted to a
yeah,
team that can kind of use him as a tweener, line him up in the slot a lot, maybe a team that already has a good inline tight end that they trust. And the reality is that for Harold Fannin to really break out in fantasy, he does kind of need an ideal landing spot at this point. So that worries me a little bit. But man, Jalen Royals and Jalen
yeah.
Knoll are two guys that I just love. They've got that after the catch ability. They've got the twitched up athleticism. They can win deep. They can win underneath. They can make plays after the catch, contested catches. They're two guys that are very, very similar when I watch them play. And Noel has been a guy who, when I first started watching, he kind of fell in as like a late round 3 guy for me. And I just keep
Yeah.
moving him up and keep moving him up. And he's a guy, you look at what he does. I see some shades of Golden Tate in his game. He's a guy that it
Mhm.
wouldn't surprise me if a team ends up getting enamored with his film and drafting him early on day 2.
I mean, just looking at the players here, you have 5 tight ends and 2. When's the last time we seen a class like that with 5 tight ends, right?
Maybe never. I mean,
Yeah.
I expect all of these guys. I would be shocked if any of these tight ends fall into even round 3. I mean, I think these are all guys that are getting drafted in the top 2 of April's draft, top 2
Yeah,
rounds.
and then you'd even mentioned Arroyo as well. You were like, man, I like this guy too. Like I could put this guy in here too. Like it's a really really interesting tight end class. And before we do let you go, Dave, there's obviously everyone's favorite topic, which is the sleeper players, right? The ones that are going under the radar. Sadly, not RJ Harvey anymore. But who is your sleeper player going under the radar you'd like in the third or the fourth?
I'll go really, really deep here. Yeah, I could talk about the guys going
Ooh,
like top of the 3rd round, but Taj Brooks is a guy that I love, and
yeah.
the numbers are there. I mean, he was very productive, and a lot of that had to do with him being in college for a long time, and I think that he kind of became one of those men beating up on boys at a certain point in his career. But
Hmm.
the thing I
Yeah.
like about Taj Brooks is that he doesn't have the elite breakaway speed, and I think a lot of people saw what he did at the combine and were disappointed with his combine performance. But I said before the combine, I said, watch Taj Brooks and the 2 drills at the combine that correlate more to fantasy success for running backs than any other position is the 3-cone drill and the shuttle drill. And
Mm,
he logged elite scores in both of those drills. And that's what it is. When you watch Taj Brooks, he's one of those guys that just has unbelievable footwork. I mean, our
yeah.
Matt Waldman over at Football Guys, he likes to say, making open up a lemonade stand with his ability to turn lemons into lemonade. He'd run into these walls where there was just no hole at all, and he would just use his very, very polished footwork to just turn what should be no gain into 3 or 4 yards. Now that might not be the sexiest thing ever, but that gets you on an NFL roster. And I think that he's already got the size, he's already got the ability and the experience that he's a guy that could get drafted on day 3 and immediately work his way up the depth chart and could be a potential starter by week 1 his rookie season.
There are so many players like that as well. Where you're like, oh yeah, Taj Brooks. You're like, oh yeah, like the so many running backs. We're like, in any other class, any other year, they'd probably sneak into the second round. But
Mhm.
because there's so many players like Devin Neal, RJ Harvey, Cam Boots, it's kind of hard to fit these running backs in. And even though we say to ourselves we shouldn't do this, I think a lot of people are like, oh well, I gotta take I can't just take all running backs. Like I
You
gotta
should.
take some receivers,
No,
right?
you
But it's
should.
like, well, maybe we should. Like
Yeah,
you
you
could,
can get your quarterbacks and tight ends early, and then for me in rounds 3, 4, and 5, I'm just kinda taking best running back available.
yeah. Yeah, and hopefully we'll see Taj Brooks there. Dave, I've had an absolute blast once again with you in the show. Thank you so much for coming in and joining on the Dynasty Hotseat once again. Can you just remind everyone where can they find all your amazing work online?
Yeah, everything is over at Football Guys. Busy, busy time of year. I'm doing the Football Guys Fantasy Football Show with Alfredo Brown. I'm also doing the Football Guys Dynasty Show with Jeff Bell. We'll be doing between 3 to 5 episodes per week between now and the NFL
Ooh.
draft. After the draft, we'll be staying busy too. We kind of take a little bit of a lull. We pull back in May and June and kind of refresh a little bit. Then starting in July, fantasy football is going to be here again before we know it. And we'll be staying busy there. But you can find all my work over at footballguys.com, coming out with mock drafts every 2 weeks between now and the draft.
Absolutely love it. Thank you once again, Dave, for coming on the show, and thank you everyone at home for listening. Again, make sure you've followed Dave everywhere, and of course the Dynasty Hotseat as well. Thanks for listening, guys, and remember, for anything Dynasty you need to know, keep it locked on the Certified Inferno. See you very soon.